Thank you very much, Professor Dursand, and thank you for inviting me. The slides are available if anybody wants them, and my email is there if you wanted to get them from that point of view. I'll start by defining creativity, and these are some definitions of it: original, meaningful, surprising, imperfect, unbalanced display of human creativity. To be creative with a big C, and there's two types of creativity. That's with a big C, which is genius, and small c, very small c, which is myself and many other people. Today the focus is on big C. It's on the creativity of genius proportions. And by definition, I think that is abnormal. In the past 1,000 years, there's one person that stands out, and that's Isaac Newton. So that gives you the frequency of creativity, of genius proportions, of if you take a scientific basis. You've read that last week. For most creative, they work in solitude, often for a very long time. Well, in actual fact, it's not solitude isn't what helps them to be creative. Many of these people have autism, and the only place that they can work on is alone. And so being alone is very easy for some people with autism, and that allows them to focus. If a child came to me and they said that they wanted to win a Nobel Prize, there's only one question I would ask that child, and that is, have you Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism? And if they said they had Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism, I would say to that child, it's still not easy to win a Nobel Prize, but at least you're starting okay, and you can go ahead. But if they didn't have high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome, then I would say, well, it's very unlikely that you'd be able to, maybe in literature or something, you might. So that they obviously many of the autistic geniuses are outsiders, and so they often live outside the country, like James Joyce, Beckett, Ibsen, and those. They prefer to be in another country where they're not interfered with, and they can do their brilliant literary work. This is one of the problems we have with creativity today, is that too much knowledge will impair creativity. If you're all the time attending lectures, reading books, etc., looking at your iPhone, getting more papers, you'll never be able to do any creative work because you're overloaded with information. So Ludwig Wittgenstein said he was the greatest philosopher, as you know, of the 20th century. He didn't read other philosophers because he said actually most of them were stupid, and that he didn't want their bad ideas to be interfering with his work. There's two great ideas in relation to creativity, in relation to creative thinking. Now, today we have difficulty getting pharmaceutical companies to develop new drugs, and as I was walking outside, I didn't see any new drugs outside, and that's because big pharma it's given up almost in getting new drugs for mental illness, and that is a terrible problem. Now, if I was advising big pharma on how to do research in this area, I would divide that into two different areas. I'd say the first phase for a year is you want to get people who are divergent thinkers, who are thinking all over the place. These are people with attention deficit hyperactivity disorder. They often have problems with attention concentration, problems following through on instructions. They don't do their homework. They're hyperactive. They're impulsive. So I would suggest to them, you get this group and you put them in a room for a year. And you will notice this group, they'll drink too much at weekends, they'll have some fights in pubs, etc. So they'll be a very annoying, disruptive group. But this group will have ideas from all over the place, and so they're likely to come up with more strange ideas that might have potential to come up with a good drug or a good compound that would be worth doing. So when they're finished, then these are the divergent thinkers, ADHD. Now you want to get the drugs developed, so they've come up with 3 compounds, and you want to get those 3 compounds developed. So now you have to switch to convergent thinkers. Now, when you interview these convergent or autistic thinkers, they have to fail every social skills. When they come into you, they have no eye contact, they speak very little, there's no emotion, but there is one little spark on their CV. So if they get 0 on every social skill, that's very good. At least then these are the kind of people you want. These are autistic people, and so these people, then you give them your problem. You have 3 compounds, you want to make the drug, so you put them in a building on their own. You don't go near them because they get upset if you interfere with them or if you supervise them. You just give them the job. Now, these are all top psychopharmacologists, they're neuroscientists, they're qualified to the nth degree, but their social skills are more or less 0. So you put them there for a year, and you give them whatever they want, and they're most likely to develop the compound that you want. And these are the convergent thinkers. This is done in 2 places. It was done in Los Alamos. They gathered all the eccentric mathematicians and physicists in America, and they put them in Los Alamos, and they told them, make an atomic bomb, and that's what they did. The other place it happened with was in Blenheim, which is it was during the Second World War. They wanted to break the German code, so they got all the eccentric mathematicians and so on in Britain. They put them all into one place, top secret, and they told them, break the code, the German code, and which they did. And they developed computers and so on, and so nobody knew that they were there, nobody knew the code had been broken. The effect of that was to reduce World War II by 2 years. So this eccentric group, and Alan Turing was the main man there. I've written a paper on Alan Turing and autism. It's the paper that people seem to Google all the time. I always find people are downloading this Alan Turing paper from ResearchGate and so on. He had very poor social skills. And he got into trouble with the law, and he got upset, and he killed himself. And after, shortening World War II by 2 years, he was the most important man, I suppose, in World War II. But he was an eccentric loner operating in this area. So those are 2 extreme examples of creativity. Now, the problem is in medical education and so on, what we want are convergent thinkers. We don't want to, because ADHD, divergent thinkers, they're troublemakers. The medical schools don't like them. They want to get rid of them. They're rebels. They're independent. They're troublemakers. They disrupt the class. But the problem is when you get rid of these from medical schools, as they're done, or you won't allow them in, then you're getting rid of possibly the most creative people in medical schools. Now, obviously, I believe that creativity is partially genetic and so on, but there are critics of this view. A lot of people believe that if you work at something intensively for 10 years, you'll become a genius. Other people say if you work for 10,000 hours on anything, you'll become a genius. I regard this as complete rubbish. Nobody in this room will become Mozart if you work on music for 10,000 hours or 10 years. There is obviously where most of the research has been done is on depression and creativity, and particularly literary people, novelists, poets, and that they have all the studies have shown that they have very high rates of depression, alcoholism, and so on. Even that work is also criticised and dismissed. Jemison is one of the persons who's done this, and Andreasen, the States, they did the early studies showing the link between artists and depression and alcoholism. These have been criticised that they used small samples, they made the diagnosis themselves, they didn't have enough males. Well, those are the criticisms to dismiss, this link between mental illness, mental disorder and creativity. Now, more recently, as you know, Carlson in Sweden has looked at thousands of patients and showing the clear link between mental illness and mental illness and creativity. So we'll take. I'm not going to go into the. Of course, there's environmental factors in developing There's epigenetic factors. Of course, there's epigenetic factors here operating as well. That factors that we don't, know too well. So the environment is there as well. And of course, money is necessary for creativity as well. We saw that in Italy during the Renaissance, and even now today, you have big funding agencies. They are critical if you want to win a Nobel Prize in certain areas. You have to have training as well. But much if you're going to be a genius, the amount of training you need is much less than if you're not a genius and don't have the correct genetic makeup. So the personality then of these creative people, they're not welcome, as I say, in medical schools. They don't obey rules. They challenge their teachers. They're independent. You have to have openness to experience. If you're if you're a literary person, they're risk takers. They're often depressed, and they can be loners. So they're not what we call good candidates for general practice or family practice. I'm going to say a few words now about diagnosis, because there is, there's a huge problem with diagnosis at this conference and every conference I go to. There's lectures on depression, there's lectures on schizophrenia, etc. The problem with psychiatric diagnosis now is that we have a neurodevelopmental spectrum of diagnosis with onset early childhood and biological and genetic findings. Now, on this neurodevelopmental spectrum, and we can't separate these diagnoses. We have autism, we have overlapping with schizophrenia, overlapping with ADHD, overlapping with Tourette's, overlapping with bipolar, overlapping with learning disability. So where we are at the moment with diagnosis is about 1860. I'm not saying now you should rewind your watches to the year 1860, but we've gone back pre-Kraepelinian. This Kraepelin separating out diagnosis into bipolar, schizophrenia, etc. That's almost certainly wrong. We don't know what the correct diagnoses are, but we do know it's transdiagnostic. There'll be and last night I was sitting beside a neuroimager. I said, you'll have to help us to make a diagnosis. It's not me telling you what the diagnosis is. We have no biomarker in psychiatry. That is an absolute tragedy. And so, the last lecture I was at here was largely on, a few minutes before lunch, was on depression. Now, I won't accept the diagnosis of depression unless you rule out high-functioning autism, unless you rule out Asperger's syndrome, unless you rule out ADHD, unless you rule out all these other conditions, and they have to be, the patients have to be assessed for all these other conditions before you, and then if you rule out all those conditions by an expert in those conditions, then, and you still at the end of the day you come up with depression, then and only then will I accept depression. I think that's why no two groups of patients are ever the same in psychiatry. Every single sample is different from every other sample. So if you can't get diagnosis right, then the whole house of cards collapses, and that's why we have so much non-replication. It's not that we have non-replication; it's that we have different samples, and everybody is looking at a different sample. Now, autism and schizophrenia were supposed to be two totally different conditions. I mean, that's complete rubbish. There's a great deal of overlap genetically and descriptively between autism and schizophrenia. They are not separate. They are not separate conditions. And so I just want to make that point. The correct diagnosis is a neurodevelopmental spectrum. But when you get down to the subcategories, then these subcategories. So now, if there's any junior doctors here, I want to say everything in the ICD-10 and everything in DSM-4 are biblical importance. So you tell your examiners about ICD-10 and DSM-5. Everything there is correct. Once you're after the examinations, then you can deal with the real world, but not before. Examinations. So I'll just take, if you take autism, then obviously they have problems with social interaction, problems with eye contact, problems reading non-verbal behaviour. They're naive and immature, problems sharing. They have sensory issues. They have pragmatic language problems and other speech and language problems. They want the same routine every day, and they have narrow interests. A lot of them will have small savant skills. Savant is originally that was called idiot savant. Obviously, that was in the 19th century. Now it's called mostly autistic savant. And these are people who they're able to see patterns in things. They could tell each person in this room the day that you will retire at 65. You just give them your date of birth, and they will tell you the date you're going to, the day, the week, and the month that you retire. And so these are what we call savant skills. You can get musical savants and so on. These are most unusual. There's no way you could. These are, they are genetically and neurobiologically involved, and they go with autism. So there's no doubt, obviously, the genetics of creativity is there's no doubt about it. I mean, what we understand about it is a different matter. We can say there's multiple genes of small effect. I assume there's hundreds of genes involved, and any information we have only deals with a small little bit of the genes, and there is variability. You can see there I've given different levels of heritability by different authors, but I mean there is no doubt about the heritability. And in some of the dopamine genes, they would be the ones that are particularly relevant to creativity, and in terms of something close to a fact. Dopamine, I think we're on, and serotonergic genes. As you know, in autism, there's very high levels of serotonin. So the central dopamine neurons may be overactive in autism, and that that's just saying much the same thing. The dopaminergic system and the frontal lobe regions are involved in creativity. When I was training, we always everything, all psychiatric conditions were blamed on mother. Now they blame the frontal lobe. That's a joke, but the frontal lobe comes up in all discussions. and obviously dopamine is critical to that. And of course, sensations of pleasure, impulse control, gambling. The ADHD people would be more into the gambling. ADA was that's the American military computer is called ADA. It's after Lord Byron's daughter, who was a mathematician, and she had autism. And then Lucian Freud is a relative. He was a major painter who's a relative of Sigmund Freud, who died just recently. So this is just looking at the genetics in a little more detail. This is one mutation that has been found, which there is support for. Reduced LI is LI stands for latent inhibition. If you can reduce the inhibition of thoughts coming into the person's head, the person will be more creative. And that particular phenomenon, reduced latent inhibition, is associated with neuroligin gene. Obviously, that's seen in both autism and schizophrenia. This is something that I disagree with, but it is that patients with autism are not overrepresented in the creative professions. Indeed, the opposite is the true, and I have hundreds of examples, and I would have half dozen books on just showing the opposite to that. But nevertheless, he makes a second point, and that is that the siblings also are siblings. According to him, siblings show higher rates of creativity. This is very much so in schizophrenia. Patients with schizophrenia, the full-blown schizophrenia, are not creative and can't be creative. So if that's so, where does Darwin come in? And where Darwin comes in and evolution comes in, while the persons with schizophrenia, full-blown schizophrenia, can't be creative, their relatives have been shown over and over again. Other family members have been shown over and over again to be highly creative. And of course, the relatives, they would have low threshold, lower levels of schizotypal traits. We'll just call it that. And it's in that area where the creativity comes. So you couldn't, evolution couldn't go ahead without the relatives of schizophrenia. Unfortunately, some of them have the full-blown schizophrenia, and those ones aren't creative, but the relatives are. And that's why schizophrenia has survived over the years. Hans Asperger said we all need a touch of autism. In actual fact, Hans Asperger, who's an Austrian child psychiatrist, unfortunately he was a de facto Nazi, and I have difficulty using the word Asperger's now because he sent children to be murdered in Vienna during the war, and that has caused. But the problem is parents don't know about that Hans Asperger was sending. So I've had to continue to use Asperger syndrome because the parents they know about Asperger syndrome. The whole population knows about Asperger syndrome, and only a minority of people know that he was involved in murderous child psychiatry. This is just an imaging study, and the prefrontal cortex, the left, certain creative problem solving involves the left dorsolateral as well as the right ventrolateral prefrontal cortex. An fMRI study was looking at divergent thinking, and again, the right prefrontal cortex showed significant activation when participants were asked to create stories in response to unrelated words. There we're talking about divergent thinking, obviously, storytelling. And I believe that this next slide really, it relates as well to literary creativity and not to scientific creativity. But here you need the integrated white matter tracks. They underlie creativity. And here these use connecting information in distant brain regions. And that gives you loads and loads of different ideas. Now, I was involved in a study in relation to creativity and autism. And here there were brains of famous scientists in America. And Casanova, he examined these brains, and I did the post-mortem psychiatric diagnosis. They all had autism. But what he found was that there was this hyperconnectivity locally, very intense local connectivity in the brain, and very poor long-range creativity. And that's kind of the situation that you find in autism. And so this is why, because it's like you have a computer, you have a central computer here, and it integrates everything. But in persons with autism, the central computer is very weak, and the local computers are very intense. You have this hyperconnectivity locally, and that's what gives you the brilliant mathematics and the brilliant science and so on. Now, if you in more literary novels and so on, you need long-range creativity. You need better social skills, and this long-range connectivity is much better for social skills. This again is saying basically the same thing, and again with upper white matter, the frontal lobes. Now, the anterior cingulate is critical to creativity, and it's involved in salience, cognitive control, executive tasks, and ranking behavioral activities. So you have increased cortical thickness in the right cingulate and the right angular gyrus. They're supposed to improve creativity. The cingulate activates a broad range of networks in the brain, the service of divergent thinking. And artistic thinking is associated with salience networks. The right cingulate cortex is associated with salience, and scientific activity was associated with executive attention networks and semantic processing. Obviously, the frontos subcortical networks are central to creativity. In terms of mathematics, people who were listening to mathematical statements and mathematicians doing mathematics, the areas that lit up there were the intraparietal, dorsal prefrontal, and inferior temporal regions of the brain. This again was for mathematics, frontal lobe, parietal lobe, central gyrus. And if we look at Einstein's brain, as you know, the brain, the pathologist that did the PM on Einstein's brain, he took it with him. He stuck it in a bottle of preservative, and he took it around in his car for years. And then, you know, he admitted that he had kept Einstein's brain, and people began to look at it and examine it. And this is what they found, that the parietal contour is 15% wider, and that there was more nerve cells and glial cells than in the normal brain. So it fits with what it fits with what we're talking about. It was an atypical, unusual brain. And any of you who have a normal brain, I have bad news for you. You'll never be Shakespeare, or you'll never be Isaac Newton. To reach this ultimate geniuses, you need atypicality. That's just artistic creativity saying much the same again. these are just other areas involved with creativity, and obviously we're talking about distributed neural networks. These are further areas involved in creativity, which is quite a lot of the brain, is involved when you in creativity when you look at it from this point of view. But there's no clear consensus about neural basis of creativity. I was going to say, is there any consensus about anything in psychiatry? But what we really have in psychiatry is incredible variability, incredible heterogeneity, incredible difference between people. I've covered this already. In autism, there's supposed to be there isn't sufficient pruning of neurons after birth, and that's what gives you the child with the large head. But that can be seen in schizophrenia as well. So there's no single neuronal circuit for creativity. And my general view is that creativity is due to disconnected neural processes out of the standard order of neural processes, and associated with equally erratic neurochemical processes. It's a non-standard brain, a creative brain, a dysfunctional brain, an atypical brain. Now here we're talking about big C, we're talking about genius, and we're talking about creativity of that level. The default mode network is very important. Brahms said that he, classical composer, that he composed in a semi-trance and the music was revealed to him. Well, it's a bit more complicated than that. I mean, Brahms trained intensively in music, in composition, in musical thinking, and all of that stuff was going on in the unconscious. Most of the creativity goes on in the cognitive unconscious. Freud had the idea that the unconscious was a chaotic area. That's rubbish. And most of what we are thinking is unconscious. And it's taking place in the cognitive unconscious, in the adaptive unconscious. So for the months leading up to this revelation for Brahms, he'd been thinking about it. He'd been putting it into his unconscious. Things had been coming out of his unconscious. He'd been working on it day and night. And the cognitive unconscious, it goes on working away during nighttime, because you've heard of great scientific advances made where the person woke up in the middle of the night and the solution to a scientific problem came to them, and then they got out of bed and wrote it out. But that was because they had been processing this problem consciously and unconsciously for years. But just the final step was the cognitive unconscious, and books and lots of other things. They're processed unconsciously before, and consciousness is obviously only the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the best metaphor I have for creativity is, think of a deep sea diver. He's down on the seabed, and he can't see that well, but there's a tube going up to a boat on the top. We'll call the boat on the top. That's consciousness, and he's feeding all this kind of information up to the man on the top, which is being, but all the 99% of the activity is taking place on the seabed by the deep sea diver. And of course, there obviously music will have an effect on brain, and the left hand in violinists, the area in the brain is larger, and so on for very good reason. I mean, the default mode network, I think, is very important, and you see the parts of it there in the brain. And this is involved in creativity, divergent thinking, self-referential thinking, reasoning about emotions, mind warrings, mental stimulation, inspiration, jazz, and so on. So if you're working on a problem and you're not getting any place, then your only way out of that problem is the default mode network. And how do you activate that? By going out for a walk, maybe go on holidays for a week. Forget completely about the problem you're trying to solve. There's a fair chance that the solution might come to the problem on your holidays. It certainly won't come if you keep the head down for the whole week, because you're blocked and you're certainly not going to. So you have to allow the cognitive unconscious to process it and give you the solution. And you'll even notice that sometimes if you're working on some problem late at night and you're really stuck and you get no place. And you go to sleep and you wake up in the morning and you go back to the same problem and it seems obvious. You don't understand what. But of course you have put it, before you went to bed, you had put the problem, you couldn't solve it, but you had put it into your head, you had put it into your unconscious, and it was being processed during the night. And then when that work was done, you woke up in the morning and you had a solution or found it much easier. So really, as I see creativity, there's two phases. One is where you think about all the possible solutions to a problem, and divergent thinking, and then when you get down to one or two or three, you get into convergent thinking, very much executive focused thinking to solve it. And the convergent executive, that is scientific thinking. So the question then is why are creative people, geniuses and so on, why are they so susceptible to mental illness? Well, I have a son who's an actor, and he has extreme emotions, and I know that he couldn't be an actor if he wasn't able to express extreme emotions, and to be moody and difficult, etc., etc. And that is the situation you find a great deal of actors or opera divas or whatever. They're difficult people, if not impossible, to live with. Although everyone seems to want to live with a genius, despite them being impossible to live with. They have high reproductive stress and high success with women and so on. But they're absolutely hell. And nobody is more hell than Ludwig van Beethoven, who had obviously autism. You know, his social skills were close enough to zero. He was paranoid as hell. He couldn't relate. He was impulsive. He was eccentric. He was obnoxious. The waiter brought him soup one day and it wasn't quite the right temperature. He threw it back in her face. That would be kind of just standard behaviour. He was a loner. He had temper tantrums. He was just about as impossible as you could imagine. He had a lonely childhood. He couldn't handle sports of any kind. He didn't wash himself that much. But poor hygiene is actually quite important for genius. Michelangelo, you know, I don't know, he would sleep in his clothes and boots maybe for a month. He would never change it. Most of these do very poorly at school, and most of the school reports say this child is useless. They'll never amount to anything. He had no social cop on. He was hypersensitive to slights. You know, he was reserved, stiff, haughty. You could hardly write it. You could hardly write it out. He had endless problems with women. The only women he could kind of handle were women that were married to other people, and he would take up with those. Not in any sexual sense, but that was. And Hans Christian Andersen also, who was the same. You know, never married, but would always take up with the wife of somebody who had married and children. He argued with everybody. And you know, he more or less stole his wife's child, and he actually said, you know, I am the boy's real father. No, this was his wife's, sorry, this was his brother's wife's child. He wasn't the real father. But this brings up, he actually believed that at times. And one of the central things for creativity is these people, they have very poor ability to separate fact from fiction. And they spend endless time in the courts. These paranoid, they're all the time going to court, and he wanted to get the child from the child's mother, and I mean, he did eventually get it after about 10 years of courts, but I mean, he treated the boy so harshly he had to be given back. And there was his music, his composition himself were one. He just lived in a one-person world. He was a self-taught, etc. So that's it. And I mean, it's the Ninth Symphony, just in my opinion, is the greatest symphony ever. Not his fifth, as most people seem to prefer the fifth, but I'm ninth. If we move on now to Bartók, it's much the same situation. He was born in Romania. He was truly original. He experimented with bitonality and all that before Stravinsky and Schoenberg. And of course, to be truly creative, you have to produce a new paradigm. You have to produce a new type of music. Otherwise, it's just replicative, and replicative is small c. He was a loner as a child. He didn't play with other children. He couldn't tolerate noise. Obviously did badly in school. That's absolutely necessary. He was oblivious to political developments. He made no concessions to the need of the audience. And the people with autism, they're always searching for bedrock things, whether it's in science or music. And he wrote for himself. I don't think he was he wouldn't be aware of when he was writing it, of the existence of the the existence of the audience. This is a man living in an autistic world. They're often great collectors, people with autism, and he did a great deal of this. He was also a massive collector of insects. He was a workaholic. He was a linguist. So many of these high-functioning autism people are linguists. He had preservation of sameness, perfectionistic. Many people would have diagnosed him as obsessive compulsive. But that wouldn't be the correct diagnosis. And they have very harsh superegos, very harsh, vicious consciousness, and fanatical wills. If we go on now to a woman, just in case you're saying I'm only, Simone Weil. Obviously, she's a French writer. She died of anorexia nervosa, and of course, anorexia nervosa does go with autism. Her brother Andrew was one of the greatest mathematicians in the world at the time. At the age of 12, she spoke many languages. Her father was a medical doctor. It was a very pressurized environment. Academically, but of course the two siblings were more than well able to. So she had poor social skills. She was aggressive and unempathic, argumentative. She was doing a thesis, but she never went to see her thesis supervisor because the thesis was done in her own autistic world. She was in Britain during the Second World War, and she used to drive de Gaulle mad. Although de Gaulle was a man who drove everyone mad, and he had de Gaulle actually was a classic. You can understand nothing about de Gaulle unless you understand his high-functioning autism. Simone Weil, she was a little Martian, and men are from Mars, or whatever they call it. Or the anthropologist on Mars, I was thinking about that. That's Temple Grandin, the person with autism and professor of architecture. She was blunt, thoughtless and solitary. She was in a world of her own. She also had very poor hygiene, and she worked on a farm for a while because she felt she had to work with the peasants. And there she never washed herself and so on. And the farmer found that very, very objectionable. All these people are childlike. If you want to be a genius, actually you have to be able to see the world through the eyes of a child. And that's what Ludwig Wittgenstein could do. That's what Einstein would do. That was his great secret. They never, to be able to, because a child sees everything. As adults, we only see bits of things. So, and this emotional immaturity and so on is classic part of genius. She had piercing eyes. She was very cutting. And so on. So, and of course, she developed anorexia nervosa in London and died from it. A lot of people with anorexia nervosa, they have autism, mostly undiagnosed. I suppose the greatest genius ever in the world was probably Michelangelo, although I thought Beethoven would be a close second. He was. They described Vasari was the guy who's to write all. He wrote all the these biographies around 1600 or so, and he described him as savage and even mad. He was aloof, he was a loner, he got on very badly with Raphael, he shunned society, he had problems sharing emotions verbally. And I suppose what Raphael, the painter Raphael, said about him is probably pretty correct. You're a loner, just like a hangman. You know, that was just before we had Asperger's syndrome or high-functioning autism. He was rough, uncouth, tactless. Again, domestic habits were squalid. He had no pupils. He had no interest in anybody, obviously except himself. He was completely narcissistic. Actually, high-functioning autism or Asperger's syndrome is very often confused with narcissistic personality disorder. He slept in his clothes and boots and rarely washed. But he suffered depression, of course. So many of the people with autism and Asperger's syndrome, they suffer depression. Unfortunately, they're diagnosed with depressive disorder, by most psychiatrists, and the Asperger's and the high-functioning autism is missed, at least in my country, maybe not here. And he tended not to finish commissions. Leonardo was even worse than that in not finishing commissions. And so he suffered from endless anxiety. Generalized anxiety disorder is extremely common with high-functioning autism, Asperger's syndrome. He said he hadn't 1 hour's happiness in the past 15 years. And he wrote about suicide longly. He never engaged, he never did it. So we move on now to probably one of the most quoted books in the world after the Bible and Shakespeare's works, and that's Alice in Wonderland and Through the Looking Glass. Cohen was the guy who wrote the autobiography. Lewis Carroll was a mathematician. Lewis Carroll, he spent his life teaching mathematics in the university in England. He was also interested in the occult. Again, we're talking about these people being interested in odd things. He was a loner. He was a shy, odd man. He was solitary. He was bullied because he wasn't interested in sports. What child with autism or Asperger's wasn't bullied? He was a recluse. What else would you expect? But he got on brilliantly with children, and he was obsessed with child nature, and he preferred girls to boys. Now, he did take a lot of photographs which were inappropriate, of children naked and that. And the people in his university, I can't remember if it was Cambridge or Oxford, one of the two. But, the parents and the other professors and so on, they knew that this wasn't, this wasn't right. And he destroyed most of them before he died. But he was just obsessed with these young children. And that's why he was able to write Alice in Wonderland, because he was able to see the world like the eyes of a child. Indeed, as was Hans Christian Andersen. And again, you could write these without me telling you them. Loner, clumsiness is very commonly associated with Asperger. Bullied in school, he was a singular, dreamy child. He was oversensitive. he had few ordinary childhood pleasures. He felt a changeling. A changeling, you know, that is a concept that's there throughout Europe, and I'm sure in Turkey as well. The notion is that there was a real child, and the child was taken away, and a replacement child was put instead. I did a paper on that once on changelings, and it's in very many cultures. But here, changeling meant identity diffusion. He felt unreal, and identity diffusion is central to autism and Asperger's syndrome. He was depressed a lot with suicidal thoughts. He felt different. And why didn't he kill himself? And of course it was Ludwig Wittgenstein thought about suicide every day, and what kept it, and 3 or 4 of Ludwig Wittgenstein's siblings completed suicide. So why didn't Ludwig? And it was philosophy that kept him alive, and he had good relationships. Not good relationships, he had people who took care of him. So autistic restlessness, autistic wonder, autistic persistence, these are very common features of high-functioning autism and Asperger's syndrome. And of course ADHD and autism, they go together incredibly often. There's a massive overlap or comorbidity between autism, Asperger's and ADHD. A teacher said nothing good can come from it. You're a stupid boy who will never be any good. No one will ever read what you write. Well, that is a fairly standard, that's what the schools mostly say. I could give you that in about 100 different ways, but that would be a standard school report for a genius. If we move on now to Van Gogh, and again, it's the same story. The thing about Van Gogh is that he probably had Asperger's and high-functioning autism most of his life, but I think he did develop psychosis at the end of his life. So you had autism. The final diagnosis would be high-functioning autism and psychosis. He was strange and unruly, self-willed. He was bored by school. He learned nothing at school. His loner, lacked social know-how, contempt for people. He was an outcast into self-alienation. This is all very standard autistic Asperger behaviour. He couldn't get on with women. I think he cut his ear off, wasn't it? He gave the ear to a prostitute for some reason. I've forgotten now why. I'm sure you all know why he did it, but you can tell me in a minute. And he was always seen as eccentric and odd. The only people he might be able to relate to was prostitutes. And his brother, who looked after him all those years, he only sold 1 or 2 pictures, I think, in his life. And his brother was selling them, and he was always giving out to his brother for not selling more. He had a childlike, naive, immature personality. He had narrow interests. He was driven. And many people with autism and high function are fantastic readers. He had speech and language problems, what we'd probably call pragmatic language problems. Today he'd have been sent to a pragmatic language therapist. Now if we move on to the greatest man for the past 1,000 years, and when this was looked at in the year 2000, pretty much everyone came up with this as the man that had changed the world. Others of you might think of a religious figure, or you might think of Hitler or Mao or someone like that. But this is because he developed calculus and so on. That underpins all of science and things like that. But as a boy, he was absent-minded. He was a model builder. Again, he was a massive reader, autodidactic. And one of his famous sayings was, "I keep the subject constant before me till the first dawnings open slowly." Well, he would spend 2 or 3 nights, 2 or 3 full days and nights focused on a problem. His valet would bring him food, but he wouldn't touch it. So I think he showed probably the most monumental concentration that anybody has ever shown. And of course you do need this monumental concentration if you're going to be dealing with. He had no pastimes, obviously, except his work. He was workaholic, he was routine. Some people would be tempted to call him obsessive compulsive. He was a meticulous, he was controlling. And these are all very typical, classic autistic Asperger features. And again, he was the greatest scientist in the world, or whatever. And still, here's the contradiction. You can understand nothing about autism and Asperger's unless you understand contradictions. He was into this alchemy and spent an enormous amount of time on alchemy, alchemy about turning base metals into gold, and analysing biblical tests. He was into numerology, he was into mysticism. So there was two sides to his personality. There was the greatest scientist for the past 1,000 years, and then he was involved in all this other absolutely stupid, ridiculous stuff. Now if we go to the past 100 years, the man that everybody agreed, at least in the year 2000, the number one man in the past 100 years, obviously Einstein. He was a physicist. He was much the same as he was slow to speak. He didn't speak until, I can't remember now, was it 3 or 4 or whatever. But so they asked him, why didn't you speak before this? And he said there was no reason to. And his first words were, the soup was hot. And whether that's a true story, but people with slow to speak, they're often called as having the Einsteinian syndrome. He had bad temper, no interest in peers, but he was fascinated, as people with autism, Asperger are, with building things, with construction. He was a loner, totally focused on physics and narrow interest. I mean, he at the end of his time in university, they wouldn't give him a job in the university. They said, this man is not fit for university. He's not university material. And they dumped him out, and he got a job down the road in the patent factory, a kind of mundane job in a patent factory. And while he was there in the patent factory, he developed the theories of relativity and so on. But again, you see, what's very important, that even the universities here, he was the worst. As far as they were concerned, he was the worst student they ever had in the university, and they couldn't wait to get rid of this stupid student. He was persistent, he was introverted and tactless, he could hyper-focus. He said what he was driving him was to know how God created the world. That wasn't obviously a religious thing, but he wanted to know how the world was created, obviously, scientifically. He said that nature distributes her gifts unevenly more. Well, that's what this lecture is about. I'm showing how gifts are distributed unevenly. Those people who believe in that everyone is born equal, and they hate this talking about genius and because it's elitism. And in China, in Japan, there is the belief there everyone can do anything. It's just laziness. If you don't become a genius, it's just laziness. But everyone has the potential to do anything. So he was again able to see the world through the eyes of a child. I only began to wonder about space and time when I had already grown up. He said the gift of fancies meant more to me than my talent for absorbing positive knowledge. See, for Einstein, he hugely emphasized intuition and the kind of almost creative intuition. He said that was the most important thing to him. I don't know where we've got to. Obviously. Like other speakers, I could go on for another 4 or 5 hours, but it'd be like a lecture from the Kremlin. But maybe will I go on for another 5 minutes?
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. We take William Butler Yeats. Well, this is an Irish. He has some connection to Turkey. He was obsessed with Byzantium. and one of his most famous poems is about Byzantium. And he felt the time in Turkey of that Byzantine era was the greatest time in the world. And if he could have been alive at an earlier time, it would be he'd want to be in Byzantium. So he had problems with reading, major spelling difficulties, and dyslexia and all that goes commonly with creativity. He was a poor student. He found school a time of failure, misery, and humiliation. Well, that's what people with autism children do. No interest in games. He was aloof. There was no eye contact. He had a lack of ordinary good nature. He said he did have relationships with women very late in his life, that he started having relationships with women, and one of them, Catherine Tynan, who was a poet herself, said he was inhuman, and he said he couldn't help. He couldn't help being inhuman. He found being with anyone was quite stressful. And just meeting people filled him with terror. Samuel Beckett, the Nobel Prize winner, and he was the same. When Samuel Beckett went into a room, he would say a cocktail. He would grip the walls. He would be in such terror of talking to people, and still he was the greatest, probably, dramatist of the 20th century. He certainly broke massive new ground in that area. I have no instincts for personal life. That's a definition of autism and Asperger. They said he was a bit malicious. Well, they can have a lot of aggression. It's sometimes felt that people with autism have no. Indeed, they can. And he created his poems in a kind of this was part of his. He would start tunelessly humming. His right hand would, and he could do that going down the street, and as he was kind of creating a poem. And the policemen would kind of approach him to stop doing that. But in Ireland, he's obviously our great poet. I'll do Kurt Cobain in case there's any younger. I shouldn't do this now. Any younger people present. Well, he was diagnosed with ADHD, and he was treated with Ritalin. Now, the problem was he didn't stick with the Ritalin, and he did get the correct diagnosis. And he came from a strange family. When he was 10. There was a history of stabbing and suicide attempts. We're talking about maternal grandmother now. She had ECT. A grandfather killed himself by his own gun. A great uncle shot himself when Kurt was 12 years old. Kurt said that he had suicide genes. And of course, one of his first lyrics was suicide symbol. He did. It was put in the. He did have suicide genes if they exist. He was. Well, he did. He completed suicide. So, his father's family were from Ireland, and his father, was had autism and Asperger's as well. He was very upset at age 9 when. And this is an environmental factor when the parents set it. And 3 brothers had died by their own hand, 2 shooting, 1 alcoholism. Of course, that's not very different from Ludwig Wittgenstein. He was a truant from school. Obviously, he was on marijuana and LSD. He had oppositional defiant disorder. And of course, there's no doubt about, we have the diagnosis was made prospectively in this rather than retrospectively. He's always on the go, accident-prone, fearless, musical, preschool, exceptional artistic skills. He was perverse, sadistically killing animals. He became homeless. He was a drifter. He went into prison. He was defiant, stubborn, obstinate. He became malnourished at the age of 10 years and was in hospital for that, probably a touch of anorexia, as we were talking about. He started making films at age 15. I think the first one was called Kurt Commits Bloody Suicide. And he said correctly, I'm going to be a superstar musician, kill myself and go out in a flame of glory. And of course that's precisely what he did. He married Courtney Love. She's still alive in 1992. He didn't invite his family to the wedding. He had a child. The social services were involved. He died by suicide at 27. The problem was that he switched from Ritalin to heroin. And then at the end he bought a gun and shot himself. But he also had identity diffusion, multiple selves, multiple histories. He felt he was a diseased person. He was sadomasochistic voyeur, out of control. But nevertheless, the youth of the world. Oh, sorry, I'll go back. The youth of the world, nevertheless, they identified with him, and he's still a huge megastar in the world. Okay. Is that okay?
I think we can have some questions as well. Thank you very much for this mind-provoking presentation.